Hi there, and welcome to The Daily Gardener, a podcast about gardening, botanical history, and literature. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and today is October 14th. Today in botanical history, we celebrate a fun little story from the White House. We'll also remember a New Zealand writer and a pop culture film that debuted on this day 27 years ago today. And today we'll also hear an excerpt from an Eva Ibbotson book. And we grow that garden library today with a book that promotes an awareness of and appreciation for Georgia's rich garden heritage. And then we'll wrap things up with an adorable little poem from one of the most prolific haiku writers who ever lived. It's a good one. Well, I have to say, I've been listening to Adele's new song, Easy on Me. When I started listening on YouTube, I think it was within the first 36 minutes. And I want to say I was within the first 100,000 or so downloads. So that was great. And then by the time I went to bed around midnight, there were over 10 million downloads. And then as long as I was looking at new songs, I ran across an artist who also released a new song yesterday, and her name is Erin Ray. Her new song is called Modern Woman, and I just love this song. So now I've got two new songs that for me are going to be the soundtrack to my autumn. So if you're looking for a couple of songs to throw on a playlist, check out Erin Ray and her song Modern Woman, and then Adele's new song, Easy on Me. They're both great. Okay, now, did you get to see the New York Times this morning? They ran an article by John Kaag, and it was called, Why Does Thoreau Live On? Well, that certainly got my attention. I'm a huge Thoreau fan, and I've tucked away most of his journal entries in my research that I do for the Daily Gardener. So this caught my attention. And, just was it yesterday's show or the day before? We were talking about the hickory leaf that his sister Sophia had written one of his poems on. In any case, this particular article started out with John talking about how he's got this 4-year-old boy named Henry, and they must live in Massachusetts because they go and visit Henry's grave. And so Henry David Thoreau's grave, his marker is very simple. It's a little marker, and all it says on it is Henry, which I think is wonderful for a man who was such an advocate for simple living that even his grave is simple. And, John was mentioning how his son calls the grave his rock because it's got his name on it, which I think is adorable. But I did learn something new from John about Henry David Thoreau that I hadn't read before, and it was his dying words. When Henry was dying, he was suffering from his final bout of tuberculosis. His sister Sophia was there. She was at his bedside, and he told her his final words, which I thought in light of his poem that we read the other day called Fairhaven, made complete sense. He said, "Now comes good sailing." Henry was looking forward to his next adventure. Well, what I also learned from John in reading this article is that there is a brand new book out, and the title is those 4 words, Now Comes Good Sailing. This is a book that was put together by Andrew Blauner, and the subtitle is Writers Reflect on Henry David Thoreau. So this is an anthology, and what he's done is he's put together 27 different essays by leading writers of our time, and they're all writing about the impact of Henry David Thoreau on their lives. So it's a good one. It comes out October 19th. So let's see, that's Tuesday. You can pre-order it. It's $25 and be a great Christmas present. I just ordered mine, so I'm excited to get that. And there is one essay in this book that John calls out. It's an essay that was written by Megan Marshall, and it's entitled Without. And here's what John wrote about this particular essay. He wrote, "The most beautiful essay here is also the most bittersweet. a Theruvian elegy written by Megan Marshall entitled Without. Marshall is now without her husband, and nothing will bring him back to life. This is, however, precisely what her words accomplish, expressing the underlying hope of good sailing, namely that the most meaningful moments, the most meaningful lives and writers are never fully lost. And that is certainly true in the case of Henry David Thoreau. It's time for today's curated news. Today's curated news comes to us from Ron Kujawski's garden column that he writes for the Berkshire Edge. This is his gardener's checklist for the week of October 14th, 2021. And in this post, Ron has tips for preparing your lawn and gardens for fall and winter, plus advice on how to bring houseplants back indoors safely, something we've already talked about this week. Now, what I love about Ron is that he does have a little bit of a sense of humor, and that comes through in his writing. He starts out this particular post, though, with these words: "Beware, nuts are falling from trees in abundance." You can add your own punchline to that comment. Well, I tell you what, as someone who just put in a fire pit underneath 2 large oak trees, yes, there are plenty of falling nuts. And if you have not had a big oak tree branch or 2 or 3 acorns hit you on the head after falling from about 50 to 60 feet, well, you're just not experiencing all that fall has to offer. Let me just say that. But as Ron points out, this has been a really good year for nut trees. And he's referring to trees like walnut trees, the butternut trees, and the hickory nuts. And of course, I would add on to that and say the oak trees with their acorns. And by the way, here's a little new word for you to learn. If you've ever seen an acorn and you see that little hat that's on the acorn, well, that's called a cupule. And what it does is it partially covers the acorn and holds it in place until it's mature. So there's your new word of the day. Now, Ron continues on with his post. He talks about harvesting fruit from ornamental trees like quince, crabapple, cherry, and plum. Now is the time to do that. He talks about cleaning up the edge of your borders, something I am very busy doing right now. My Maple Grove borders are terrible, so I need to spend some time this next week and work on that. And it sounds like the weather is going to hold out, so that'll be great. You know, Ron has a great tip for us here. He talks about edging the borders. And if your borders are not properly edged, that's where you're going to see grass and weeds encroaching on your garden borders. So the fix here is very simple. Ron says, use a garden spade, a straight edge shovel, or a half moon edger, and create a neat edge with a shallow trench at the grass line. You just basically dig a small trench at the seam where your garden meets the lawn. Now, what that little trench line does is it allows the mulch to kind of fill in that area. So you get a deep layer of mulch right there on the edge. And that also serves to help hold in moisture in that garden bed. It keeps the mulch from going out of the bed, which is something you don't want. You want it to be nice and clean. So that little trench is like a little holding area. And then it also really serves to kind of fortify that barrier and keep the grass out of your garden bed. So that's a really great reminder this time of year. And it's a great time to do it, because it's so hard to do things like that in the spring when all you want to do is plant and then check and see what didn't make it and what did make it and kind of ooh and ah about being back in the garden. But we don't always think about this best practice of making sure that that border is nice and clean. And, you know, fall is a great time to do it because you know where your failed borders are. You know where your edges are problems because you've had all summer to observe your garden, and you can easily spot the breakthroughs, the places where you've had breakthroughs with grass or weeds. These are now the places that need a little bit of fortifying, and you can do that by doing this trenching technique and then getting that plant material that you don't want out of your border, pulling that out, and then adding a fresh layer of mulch before you head into winter. Now, Ron wraps this post up by encouraging us to continue planting your trees, shrubs, and perennials. We've got about 2 weeks. We've got this closing window where we can make that happen. Now, you may be asking yourself, why is that timing so important? Why does it matter? Why can't I go out there and plant in 6 weeks, even if it still stays warm? Well, that's a great question. We are experiencing the reverse of what we experience in the spring. And that is that we need to pay attention to soil temperature. So right now, because it's been unseasonably warm, the air temperature stayed warm and the soil has stayed warm. And that's why we've got these next 2 weeks to get plants in the ground, things like trees, shrubs, and perennials. Because the soil is warm, they'll get a little bit acclimated, they'll nestle in, and they stand a better chance of being able to handle that transplant because the soil temperature is warm. But if you wait until the air temperature starts to cool and then the ground temperature is getting colder and colder and colder, and then you try to stick a plant in the ground at that point, well, it just does not have enough time to get established. When it gets so cold like that, the plant is going dormant. The root growth just does not happen as vigorously, if at all. And so that really makes it hard for those plants and trees and shrubs to get established. And so that's why you really want to do it sooner rather than later. I think this week is perfect. I just spent all last week clearing out the edge of our woods. We really spent a good deal of time going through that. And the whole time I'm doing it, I'm thinking about all the different types of trees that I want to get planted. And so now this coming week, that's all I want to do. That's tree week. And I really want to go through and reforest in those areas where we were basically taking out scrub. So that's what I'm going to be doing this week. So think about that. Think about soil temperature in addition to air temperature. But that air temperature, when you look at that, look at what's happening in the evening. We can have an 80-degree day and we can think, wow, this is great. Fall is just taking its sweet time. But you can have temperatures really plummet at night. So that's why I say we're kind of going through the reverse of what we go through in the spring when we're itching to get outside. We have a nice day and we think, well, why can't I put all these plants outside? It's because you've got the nighttime temperatures that are so cold and that soil temperature isn't warm. So right now, everything's going to start cooling off. You've got warm soil temps and warm air temps, but that's going to cool off really quickly. It only takes a couple of very cold nights for that soil temperature to start to plummet. And that is when things just really start to grind to a halt in the root systems of our plants, trees, and shrubs. So there you go. Things to consider. And Ron brings all of this to the forefront with his suggestions for us for what we should be doing in our garden this week. So definitely check out this post by Ron. And of course, I've put it in the Facebook group for the show, so you can easily find it there. Just look for the word checklist and Ron's post will pop up. The other thing you can do is, if you just don't even want to look for keywords, is just start to scroll through. As soon as you hear it on the show, head on over to the Facebook group and you'll probably see the newest stuff that I'm talking about. It'll all be right there at the top. So that's really, really easy. Now, if you're not in the Facebook group for the show, don't worry about it. You can always join. I'd love to see you in there. It's so easy. All you have to do is search for us on Facebook. It's called Daily Gardener Community. Could not be easier. So I hope to see you in there. Feel free to share pictures of your garden, ask your garden questions, and definitely share your favorite garden books. I especially love hearing about what you enjoy reading or your favorite go-to resources. That's always so great to hear about. All right, I have a really fun collection of stories for today's botanical history, so let's get to it. Here's botanical history for today, October 14th. It was on this day, October 14th, in 1862, that President Lincoln writes to his Navy captain, John Dahlgren, and he asks him to find a gun for his youngest child, 9-year-old Tad. In the note, Lincoln specifically asked for, quote, a little gun that he cannot hurt himself with. Well, Tad was just 7 years old when he arrived at the White House. And the very next day, the Civil War started, and the constant presence of soldiers and all that battle talk sparked Tad's early love of the military. Tad and his brother Willie played together, and they often pretended to be soldiers in the White House, where the roof was their fort and the attic was a prison. And one of Tad's favorite toys was a doll that he named Jack, and he got Jack as a gift from the Sanitary Commission. Jack was part of many imaginary battles and skirmishes. He suffered grueling amputations, which would then get sewed back on. He suffered all manner of injury and was even sentenced to prison. Now, a young woman named Julia Taft had younger brothers that often played with the Lincoln boys, and she would end up being their babysitter, so she was watching all 4 of them together. And in her memoir of the Lincoln White House, that's called Tad Lincoln's Father, she wrote it in 1931, she tells us how Jack was regularly buried with honors in the White House gardens, to the dismay of the head gardener named John Watt. Now, Tad had already irritated the head gardener after he ate strawberries that were intended for a White House dinner. Can't you just see that happening? Well, when Mr. Watt suggested that Jack might be pardoned, I'm sure he was hoping then that he wouldn't have to get buried in the garden, Tad took him seriously, and he ended up going to his father and asking him to give Jack another chance. Well, President Lincoln was a pretty good sport about this. He got out a pen and paper and wrote these words: "The doll Jack is pardoned by order of the president." And then he signed it, A. Lincoln. And today is the birthday of Katherine Mansfield. She was a New Zealand poet and writer, and she was born on this day, October 14th, in 1888. Katherine once wrote, "The mind I love must have wild places." And later on, reflecting on her life, she wrote, "I want a garden, a small house, grass, animals, books, pictures, music. And out of this, the expression of this, I want to be writing." Katherine's book, The Garden Party, is a collection of short stories that she wrote, and they cover the gamut of emotions. And the very first story in the book is called The Garden Party, and you can read it in full on so many different places online. I know Gutenberg has it, but then other bloggers and writers and all kinds of websites have shared The Garden Party in full on a post. And I shared one of them in the Facebook group for the show. So if you're looking for it, you just want to read this little short story called The Garden Party, you can easily do so. You don't have to buy the book because it's out there. It's in the public domain. Now, I'm not going to do any type of analysis on the story, but just from a pure gardening standpoint, the opening paragraph is a delight. And so that's what I wanted to share with you today. And it goes like this: "And after all, the weather was ideal. They could not have had a more perfect day for a garden party if they had ordered it. Windless, warm, the sky without a cloud. Only the blue was veiled with a haze of light gold, as it is sometimes in early summer. The gardener had been up since dawn, mowing the lawns and sweeping them, until the grass and the dark flat rosettes where the daisy plants had been seemed to shine. As for the roses, you could not help feeling they understood that roses are the only flowers that impress people at garden parties, the only flowers that everybody is certain of knowing. Hundreds, yes, literally hundreds, had come out in a single night. The green bushes bowed down as though they had been visited by archangels. Isn't that a great opening paragraph? Well, there was one other piece of work that I found by Katherine Mansfield that I wanted to share with you today, and this is one of her poems, and it's called Chamomile Tea. Outside, the sky is light with stars. There's a hollow roaring from the sea. And alas, for the little almond flowers, the wind is shaking the almond tree. How little I thought a year ago, in that horrible cottage upon the lea, that he and I should be sitting so and sipping a cup of chamomile tea. Light as feathers, the witches fly. The horn of the moon is plain to see. By a firefly under a jonquil flower, a goblin toasts a bumblebee. We might be 50, we might be 5, so snug, so compact, so wise are we. Under the kitchen table leg, my knee is pressing against his knee. Our shutters are shut, the fire is low, the tap is dripping peacefully. The saucepan shadows on the wall are black and round and plain to see. And it was on this day, October 14th, in 1994, that Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction opened in theaters. And I remember going to see this with my husband on a date night. In the movie, you might remember that Uma Thurman's character tells a joke. It's a little bit of a garden joke, so I thought I'd share it with you today. 3 tomatoes are walking down the street. A papa tomato, a mama tomato, and a little baby tomato. Baby tomato starts lagging behind. Papa tomato gets angry, goes over to baby tomato and squishes him and says, "Ketchup." It's time for today's unearthed words. Today's unearthed words come to us from the writer Eva Ibbotson. This is an excerpt from her book, The Morning Gift. "Gardeners are never wicked, are they?" said Ruth. "Obstinate and grumpy and wanting to be alone, but not wicked. Oh, look at that creeper. I've always loved October so much, haven't you? I can see why it's called the month of the angels." It's time to grow that garden library with today's book, Seeking Eden by Stacy Catrone and Mary Ann Eady, with photos by James Lockhart. This book came out in 2018, and the subtitle is A Collection of Georgia's Historic Gardens. What a fantastic topic. I always say that Georgia loves their gardens on a level that could rival the way England loves their gardens. And of course, what I love about this book is that it's marrying the beauty of these gardens, the design, the particular elements that make it special, a little bit about the families and the people that grew up and got to live in these beautiful gardens, along with the fantastic history of the gardens. So I just absolutely love this book. And it is so, 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 so beautiful. Now, this book takes us back to the mid-18th century, to the early 20th century. So that's the time period that we're focusing on here. And surprisingly, you're going to see all kinds of gardens in this book, not just colonial revival gardens or country place era landscapes, but you're going to see things like rock gardens, town squares, college campuses, and even an urban conservation garden. Now, the authors do a wonderful job of walking us through the history of Georgia's gardens. And by the way, all of the gardens that are featured in this book, with the exception of 10, are all public spaces, so you can go and visit them, no problem. And another thing to keep in mind when you're talking about Georgia and Georgia gardens is that Georgia was a battlefield during the Civil War. And so even if some of these gardens managed to get through unscathed, they still had to pull themselves out of the upheaval of the time, because you had all of the economic, social, and political factors that definitely had an impact on these gardens. And so that adds a very unique dimension to the history of these gardens as well. But as I mentioned earlier, Georgians love gardening. In fact, the very first garden club that was founded in the United States that was super official with things like a constitution and bylaws was the Ladies' Garden Club, and it was established in Athens, Georgia in 1891. Then, of course, you've got the Garden Club of America that gets formed in 1913. And that was really through a united effort of 11 different garden clubs, including, of course, the Garden Club of Georgia. So I share all of this to underscore the deep love of gardens and gardening in the state of Georgia. And that's why, of course, this is such a wonderful book. And it's a big book. This book is 488 pages of Georgia garden heritage. You can get a copy of Seeking Eden, a collection of Georgia's historic gardens by Stacy Catrone, Mary Ann Eady, with pictures by James Lockhart, and support the show using the Amazon link in today's show notes for just $24. Finally, here's something sweet to revive the little botanic spark in your heart. Today is the birthday of Masaoka Shiki, the Japanese poet, author, and literary critic. He was born on this day, October 14th, in 1867. Sadly, he died of tuberculosis at the age of 34 in 1902. Regarded as one of the 4 haiku masters, Masaoka helped develop the modern form of haiku poetry, and he personally wrote nearly 20,000 haiku verses in his all-too-short life. Now, in researching him, I stumbled on a wonderful video by Roger Pulvers, who not only reads some of his haikus, but he does a masterful job of explaining his most controversial haiku, which happened to be about the coxcomb. It was about a simple flower. Now, I'm not going to ruin it for you. I don't want to spoil it, but you really should head on over to the Facebook group and check out this video by Roger Pulvers, where he helps us to better understand and appreciate Masaoka's poetry. And plus, I think you'll really enjoy hearing that haiku that he wrote about coxcomb. But today, I thought I would end the show with one of his garden-inspired haikus that also happens to be seasonally appropriate because he's referencing the shoulder season of autumn. So here is this little haiku from Masaoka, and I'm calling it his Fall Garden Haiku. I do not know the day my pain will end, yet in the little garden I had them plant seeds of autumn flowers. Thanks for listening to The Daily Gardener. And remember, for a happy, healthy life, garden every day. The Daily Gardener is produced in lovely Maple Grove and Wyoming, Minnesota. If you want to read today's show notes, just head on over to thedailygardener.org. And while you're there, be sure to sign up for my free Friday newsletter. And don't forget that you have a standing invitation to join the free Facebook group for listeners of the show. Just search for Daily Gardener Community the next time you're on Facebook and request to join. Last but not least, you can always get in touch by emailing me at jennifer@thedailygardener.org. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and as always, have a great day in the garden, and we'll see you tomorrow.